Trump has stunned the world with a shocking declaration. The United States does not need to sign any trade agreements. Is this a reckless gamble, or just a spectacular flip in the political game? While the entire government and markets were betting on major deals, Trump suddenly denies them all. Is he disrupting the global trade rules or simply aiming to seize absolute control? The answer could change the entire landscape of the world economy. Everything seemed to be nearing the finish line. The entire White House team, from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, enthusiastically declared that a major trade deal was very close. They insisted that only a few steps remained, and Secretary Bessent even appeared on CNBC to share the wonderful progress both sides had achieved. However, just one day later, President Trump suddenly flipped the board. In a shocking statement on May 13th, he bluntly said, "The United States does not need to sign any trade agreements with anyone." He did not stop there, adding a defiant remark. "They have to sign with us, and us? We do not need their market." The entire country was stunned. These words directly contradicted everything his cabinet had said before. It was as if all plans and strategies were torn apart in just a few sentences. Trump's advisors were immediately put in a difficult position. They didn't know how to explain this to the media and markets. Scott Bessent, who had been enthusiastic on television just yesterday, suddenly became the person hunted for his strange contradiction. Meanwhile, investors and international allies began to genuinely worry. The big question arose: is this a masterful negotiation strategy or the biggest policy shock of the year? No one could be sure. The only certainty was that with Donald Trump, anything can happen, and often when no one expects it. After the no need for deal statement shook the political world, President Trump continued to deepen the confusion with a strangely vague promise. When asked about agreements with major partners like India or Japan, he casually responded, "One day we will give you 100 deals." It sounded grand. But when exactly? And what are these deals about? No one knew. What's notable is that only a few weeks earlier, on April 29th, Trump said negotiations with India were progressing very well. But by May 14th, he said nothing more on the details. South Korea and Japan also fell into silence, and so the picture of America's trade policy became more unpredictable than ever. Some say Trump does this on purpose, and there is reason to believe so. He doesn't hesitate to reverse his own words or deny the very statements his cabinet made. In Trump's view, shocking the public is a tactic, controlling the news cycle, shifting public opinion, and keeping everyone waiting to see what he says next. That's how he commands the stage. However, in these twists, he also openly criticizes his close advisors. They promise too much, he says, as if all expectations do not come from himself. Then, he compares the United States to a luxury store, saying America does not need to please customers but can set the rules, even lowering prices to attract buyers instead of bending over backward in negotiations. The story increasingly resembles a play where only Trump holds the script, and everyone must admit he is directing it in a way no one anticipated. If you think China is America's #1 trade adversary, think again. According to President Trump's account, the European Union, EU, is actually the bigger thorn in his side. Trump once declared, without hesitation, the EU is a trade enemy even worse than China. Sounds like a declaration of war? Probably so, and he has reasons to think that way. Let's start with the auto industry, an area Trump is especially passionate about. Every year, the EU exports up to 13 million cars to the United States. Meanwhile, the US sells not a single car to the EU market. The imbalance is glaringly obvious, and Trump simply won't accept it. But the tension doesn't stop at automobiles. It spills over into high-tech sectors as well. Major US tech sectors like Apple, Google, and Meta have repeatedly been targeted by the EU for antitrust violations. The hefty fines frustrate the American tech community, and Trump, naturally, is far from silent on the matter. And then there's pharmaceuticals, another hot-button issue. The EU is accused of rigidly keeping drug prices low while benefiting from medications invented and researched in the US. According to Trump, Europe is freeloading off American effort and investment without sharing the costs. One sector after another, Trump has plenty of reasons to view the EU as a bitter rival in trade. Unlike his tough stance on China, which usually involved negotiations, Trump's attitude toward the EU is much more exasperated, almost as if he feels betrayed by longtime allies. The question is this the preparation for a new front in the global trade war? With Trump, anything can happen, anytime. If someone asks whether the US-EU relationship under Trump is friendly or hostile, the answer is probably it depends, because throughout his first term, Trump constantly switched roles between handshake partner and fierce adversary. When he first entered the White House, he viewed the EU as a strategic ally, especially on major issues like Iran and Russia. Things seemed to be on track, until Trump took a closer look at the trade balance and realized the EU might be taking too much. So he suddenly threatened to slap a 25% tariff on European cars, sending manufacturers in Germany, France, and Italy into a sweat. Markets scrambled and allies were unsettled. But then, a year later, everything changed again. Trump unexpectedly shook hands with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and signed a temporary trade deal to ease tensions. Then, the storm returned. Today, Trump no longer hides his feelings. He bluntly ranks the EU as a trade rival more dangerous than China, a position no one wants to occupy. Perhaps, to Trump, the EU is like an old friend who once was close but now feels like a betrayer. Things change on a dime. Yesterday, a coffee and handshake. Today, a sharp criticism. Ultimately, the US-EU saga under Trump is like a long-running drama filled with cooperation, anger, threats, and détente. But with Trump's unpredictable style, no one can be sure what the next episode will bring. Amid all the back and forth, tariff threats and half-signed deals, numbers are the one thing that never lie. And when you look at the trade statistics between the US and the EU versus the US and China, you can clearly see why Trump is so troubled. Let's start with Europe. Every year, trade volume between the US and the EU reaches $1.3 trillion, a colossal figure. But behind that number is a roughly $200 billion trade deficit, meaning the US buys far more from the EU than it sells there. With China, the total trade volume is smaller, about $750 billion a year, but the deficit is the same, $200 billion. To Trump, this is unacceptable. He openly calls it an unfair game. To rebalance the board, the US forced China into a tariff reduction deal. US tariffs on Chinese goods dropped from 145% to 30%, while China also made concessions, lowering tariffs on US goods from 125% to 10%. But with the EU, it's not so smooth. Instead of making concessions, the EU retaliated by imposing tariffs ranging from 20 to 25% on American goods, further escalating trade tensions. Suddenly, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, bourbon whiskey, and American agricultural products became more expensive in Europe, something Trump cannot overlook. In the big picture, the issue isn't just about money, it's about power, pride, and the battle for dominance on the global stage. In Trump's eyes, every deficit number is a thorn, a sign that America is being bullied, something he vows to reverse at all costs. When President Trump declared the United States does not need to sign any trade agreements, not only the media but also the global financial markets were shaken. Investors began to worry, fearing a recession might come as tariffs continued to rise, disrupting already complex and sensitive supply chains. Many businesses, especially those relying on global supply chains, felt lost. They did not know how US policy would shift. Maybe today there was one agreement, but tomorrow a complete reversal. This uncertainty threw production and business plans into chaos, harming the economy as a whole. What is more striking is that the turmoil did not stop at financial markets. Even America's closest allies found themselves in a difficult position. Japan, South Korea, and India, key partners in the trade network, expressed confusion in the face of the unpredictable and surprising moves from the US. They had hoped for stable cooperation, but now everything seemed uncertain. Even Canada, a longtime ally, could not avoid skepticism. Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke cautiously, unwilling to jump to conclusions amid the wave of shocking declarations from the US trusted advisors like Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick. Once confident in the negotiation process, now struggled to explain the shifting policies to both the media and the public, as constant changes rendered forecasts meaningless. In this broader picture, the trade war is not just about tariffs, but also a crisis of trust, forcing everyone, from investors to allies, to ask, Does the US truly have a clear strategy, or are these merely shocking statements meant to dominate the news cycle? While the country was still reeling from his tough trade rhetoric, President Trump shocked again with a completely opposite decision on high technology. Instead of maintaining the tightened export controls on AI chips implemented by the Biden administration, he announced their removal, opening the door for giants like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel to freely export AI chips to international markets. This decision was announced just after the Biden administration's restrictions officially took effect on the 15th of May. The news immediately caused NVIDIA's stock to leader in AI chip technology to soar, delighting investors. NVIDIA quickly welcomed the move, viewing it as a step toward maintaining America's leading position in the burgeoning new industrial revolution. Even the US Department of Commerce acknowledged that prior regulations were too complex, bureaucratic, and slowed innovation, signaling a consensus on the need to remove barriers hindering the tech sector's growth. However, this shift raised questions about the consistency of Trump's policies. During his first term, he had aggressively tightened chip exports and banned US companies from cooperating with Chinese tech giants like Huawei. Now, with this decision to reopen the gates, is it a sound strategic move, or simply a surprising flip-flop? President Trump clearly does not want to follow the traditional path of negotiation. Instead, he chooses to create major waves in the media, causing both partners and allies to be startled and unsettled. His unpredictable and often shocking negotiation style leads many to ask, is this a deliberate strategy or simply a reckless gamble without a clear plan? The series of contradictory statements from Trump has not only eroded trust among allies and partners, but also rattled financial markets due to policy instability. His harsh attacks on the European Union, refusal to sign trade agreements, while simultaneously promising a slew of major deals in the future, seem like a tactic to distract domestic opinion and add more drama to the negotiating table. Now, the future of US trade agreements and technology policies is more uncertain than ever. Everyone is closely watching his next moves, wondering whether this shock tactic will bring success or merely become an expensive lesson in international diplomacy.